You can see a lamp, a dancing skeleton, and individuals with the tomb and with a skull and crossbones.
Inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies, not just in aspects of how we celebrate the dead or the rituals we use for death, but in a broader and more comprehensive way they provide collective perspectives on worldviews at given points in time, and they reflect the cultural aspects of the people who created these monuments or mementos. Of course, there is the obvious point that people immediately understand, such as genealogies, but far beyond this, they provide us with an intellectual discourse of the way previous societies have seen the world in which they lived, how they related to that broader view, and how this was played out.
Hello and welcome to Tales from the Tombs. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. In last week's program, we concluded a two-part feature on the Jewish cemetery right here in historic Bridgetown. This week we shall continue on the UNESCO designation and bring you tales to be found here in the yard of the Cathedral of St. Michael and All Angels. Our tour guides are Senator Professor Henry Fraser and historian Dr. Carl Watson. Both gentlemen have worked tirelessly and continue to do so for the preservation of the history and heritage of this island. This is exemplified in their many publications and their voluntary work. This program is testimony of the latter. To Dr. Watson and Senator Professor Henry Fraser, I cannot begin to thank you for your good work with Tales from the Tombs. In 1825, the Church of St. Michael was elevated to the status of a cathedral, with William Hart Coleridge as the bishop of this newly created Diocese of Barbados and the Leeward Islands. Of course, at that time, this was regarded as being among the most prestigious pieces of burial grounds on the island. Well, it was in the yard of the cathedral, the place where you'll find the seat of the bishop. While many had lofty aspirations to be buried here, of course, for obvious reasons, only a few could earn a place on this holy ground, cathedral burial space, as it were. For the most part, your status in society and your wealth and allegiance to this cathedral determine your place in this yard, an example of social stratification even in death.
This graveyard is again representative of the mercantile elite of Bridgetown over the centuries. Another thing that is fascinating about graveyards is that graveyards are a reflection of class in any given society. And if you go to the very large cemeteries of the world, I mean, these mausoleums are dwarfed by the huge structures that people erect in Buenos Aires, in La Recoleta, in Hollywood, in London, in Paris. There are these world-famous cemeteries, and it's fascinating to go through them and see the extent to which people actually invest money in commemorating the existence and passing of their loved ones.
Well, although the memorial ledgers here are on a smaller scale in comparison to those you would find in major cities around the world, they, however, do tell us a lot about those interred. Senator Professor Henry Fraser joins the tour from the southern porch of the cathedral, where he provides some information on the construction and ponders on the size of the memorial ledgers here.
We're standing here in the south porch of St. Michael's Cathedral. Now, let's just remember that St. Michael's Cathedral was first a wooden church, and a proper stone church was built between 1664 and 1665. But over the next 100 years, this church building had enormous problems. There were problems with Collamer, the first major builder, Robert Collamer, and then there were problems later on with a man called John Thody. And the church was constantly having to be rebuilt. And the wall on the north side was a real problem. They couldn't get the roof right. The roof displaced the walls fell down, they were rebuilt. But here in the south porch, it seems, nothing seems to have gone wrong. And the fact that this south porch is so solidly built with walls which are 2 feet thick and in the Georgian style suggests that it may well have been a survivor of the original church. We just don't know. And in the floor of this south porch, we have the memorial tablets, and on the wall we have memorial tablets, which are the very oldest that I can find. The very oldest of all is right here on the right, 1669, and there's one here of 1673. On the floor we have 1680s, 1695, and over there 1718. And one wonders about the stories and the lives of these men who were so important that in those very early days they could command a tablet that was 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide in their memory. This obviously reflects a tremendous contribution to the society of those early days of the settlement of Barbados.
And so from the settlement of Barbados to the settlement of South Carolina and its link with the iconography to be found here in this cathedral yard. You would recall that between 1670 and 1690, about 54% of the individuals who emigrated to South Carolina did so from Barbados. Regardless of the island of origin, most of the settlers were called Barbadians. So successful was this expedition that the term the settlement of South Carolina by Barbados was used. There was an active trade between the two, as documented in the book The Barbados-Carolina Connection by one of the tour guides in this series, Senator Professor Henry Fraser, and his co-author, Warren Alleyne. This next piece of iconography along the pathway bears testimony of the link between Barbados and South Carolina during that period.
Well, what is important is, if I can point this out to you, if I go down and look, it says here, made in Charlestown, which subsequently became Charleston, South Carolina. So here is an example of this link that existed between Barbados and the Carolinas, bearing in mind, of course, that much of the colonizing venture for the Carolinas came from Barbados in the 1660s, 1670s. And this is a tangible example of that connection.
And so we return to the southern porch of the cathedral and call attention to what was regarded as the most famous icon of death, the skull and crossbones.
If you remember, when we were in the Jewish cemetery, I showed you an example, and here it is replicated in a Christian church, and you have the skull and crossbones, and at the head of the skull, the hourglass right here. Time and death juxtaposed together. And if you recall, in the Jewish graveyard, we saw precisely the same iconography. And as I pointed out, this was an accepted Christian icon of the time, not one that one would ordinarily see in a Jewish graveyard, and again evidence of the degree of creolization and acculturation that took place when various cultures came together in this small island of ours. And if we come over here to this plaque, which is mounted here in the wall, it lists a number of people, but the important one for consideration here is John Codrington. And he was the father of the well-known Christopher Codrington, the person whose bequest led to the creation of Codrington College. And again, continuing on with the idea of iconography and how iconography existed at different points in time and change, In the 17th century, here we have the standard iconography of the skull. And over here in this corner, you have the spade and the pickaxe. So, again, I remind you that when we were in the Jewish graveyard, we saw precisely these same symbols being used here. Now, of course, there are differences. This includes a coat of arms as the one that we saw previously. And of course, coat of arms speak to the fact that many of the early English colonists on Barbados came from families of the English gentry who had the right to bear a coat of arms. And so when he died, you saw this reflected in the tombstones which were put in place.
Many have heard stories of the New England lady called Tituba, who showed two little girls how to turn an egg into a boat on a Good Friday. Something that eventually led to the witch frenzy in New England and the death of Tituba, who incidentally was from Barbados.
These two ledgers that are buried here are very important ones here in the cemetery. They speak to William Pickman, who, as we see, came from Salem. Now, again, we may have lost touch or awareness of these strong historical links that existed between Barbados and New England in the 17th and early 18th century. But if you remember, Salem was the home of the famous witch frenzy and the witches of Salem. And that is something that is entrenched, ingrained in USA history. But this whole furor and hysteria related to the witches of Salem really had its origins in a Barbadian priest and his slave Tituba, who left Barbados and went to Salem. Reverend Payne and Tituba, very well known. But what I personally find fascinating is, if you look up here at the iconography, you can see a lamp, a dancing skeleton, and individuals with the tomb and with a skull and crossbones. So you have here the cavalcade of life and death. And from the late medieval period on into the early 18th century, death was seen as a dance. And often death was depicted in this macabre fashion. Over here, sadly, slightly obliterated or covered by some cement which has fallen on it, is a very beautifully carved winged cherub. And winged cherubs, again, standard iconography of the early 18th century, very representative of New England funerary carving, and these undoubtedly were carved in New England and sent to Barbados, where these individuals, probably visited as merchants, died and were buried. And of course, as I'd mentioned, death came early. Mr. Pickman died at the age of 24 years and 6 months. And Mr. Lee was just 31 years when he died. And we have here yet another example of New England funerary art. And the skull. And this individual who died in 1741, Mr. Waters. So these are three nice examples of New England funerary carving of the early 18th century here in St. Michael's Cathedral. Here you have another example, a better one you can appreciate. Family crest, and Wadeson died 1723, and also the bodies of their 3 children Again, death coming very early. And some very early tombstones in here, 1670, some even earlier.
Freemasonry has had a long and rich history in Barbados. In fact, this fraternal organization is regarded as one of the oldest established movements on the island, dating back to the year 1740. Today, it is still a very active organization, boasting many members who meet at various lodges all around the island. In this cathedral yard, there is to be found a vault that perhaps should be a shrine for all Freemasons in Barbados.
The individual who is buried here is Alexander Irvin. And as it states quite clearly, he was the founder of Freemasonry in Barbados. And here we have his coat of arms. And in the Jewish graveyard, there's a grave of Valverde, who very shortly after Irvin started Freemasonry here in Barbados in the early 18th century, he became one of the first Freemasons on the island. And his gravestone actually incorporates, it didn't have a coat of arms, but it incorporated aspects of Freemasonry, the square and other aspects related to the ritual paraphernalia that Freemasons use in their specific rituals.
It must be noted that His Excellency Major General Sir Evans Murray McGregor, whose name now dignifies a street in Bridgetown, was also interred in this tomb. In fact, that ceremony took place exactly 101 years after Alexander Irvin brought Freemasonry to Barbados.
We're standing in front of the memorial tablet in brass to one of our governors. This is His Excellency Major General Sir Evan J. Murray McGregor, Baronet, KCB, KCH, who was chief of the Clan Gregor, Governor of Antigua, then Governor and Commander in the Leeward Islands, and finally promoted to the great jewel of the crown, the governorship of Barbados, which in that era was one of, if not the, most important and pleasurable governorships to hold. McGregor came here, there's a portrait of him in the House of Parliament, and McGregor was obviously a significant man and a powerful man. I have a great fascination for this man because he came and he protested that Government House was in too bad a condition for him to live there. And he lived at Hastings House in part of Hastings Village, what was the old Hastings Plantation, a very much smaller house, in fact, than Government House, although a beautiful, solidly built house. But he was obviously an important man. He was a Scotsman, like my ancestors who came here in the 18th century, nearly 100 years before. But unlike my ancestors who may have been sheep stealers or teachers, we don't know what, pushed off the land when those wicked Englishmen went north and grabbed all the lands of the Scots in the southern highlands, and they drove thousands of people out, and many Scots fled to the Caribbean. Some were taken as prisoners and were sent out to work as indentured servants, or a form of slavery almost, servitude, and they became known perhaps as the Scotland Johnnies of our eastern parishes. Others simply fled for their lives because their lands were being taken and they were being persecuted by the sword. But McGregor was quite different. He was a powerful man who had tremendous influence and got to the top of the diplomatic profession by the middle of the 19th century. So you have to give him credit as a Scotsman for being as influential as the modern day English politicians like Mr. David Cameron and Mr. Gordon Brown.
This theatrical piece is typical of the late 18th and 19th century period, when ideology of Romanticism was starting to root itself in people's imaginations, in poetry writing and in funerary architecture.
I have to clean away the grass a bit so that we can have a better appreciation of it. So here you have, it's like a set theatre scene. You see the curtain drawn back, and you see the grieving individual, and the urn, a direct link between the what informed Romanticism, which was very often the Greek classical period. And so you have a lot of Greek iconography from classical Greek history, which then became popular. And style informs much of human behavior. We adapt to style, we enjoy style, we enjoy new styles, and we like to keep abreast of the latest style. We like to show that we're not stuck in the mud. We have to be cool and be with it. So even in funerary architecture, people showed their coolness, the fact that they were keeping abreast with the times. So out with the old skull and crossbones and in with a funerary tableau like this, which looks like a set theatre piece. And that's essentially what it was. Death had become sort of a staged manifesto. And families would gather around the dying, and it was a long played out personal tragedy, but there was, as I said, a bit of the theatre about it. And ultimately, when the individual was buried here, then you had this type of iconography on the gravestone, the grave ledger. As I said, that's one of my favorite pieces in here.
Today, the cause of death is recorded on the deceased death certificate. It is not the custom to have it recorded on the tombstone or the headstone. However, in earlier years, an important piece of information people did get when they read inscriptions on headstones or tombstones was the cause of death, as revealed in this next inscription.
Now, this particular one to Maria Ann Marriage, she died of yellow fever. Today, we haven't got the foggiest idea what yellow fever is.
That's right.
But yellow fever devastated and decimated the population of Barbados in the 19th century. If I were to describe yellow fever would be like dengue multiplied by a factor of 10. And it's caused yellow fever because, particularly in fair-skinned people, it affects the liver and their skin turns yellow. But anybody who had yellow fever, it affected their liver and other internal organs. It caused severe vomiting, very high fever, and ultimately you vomited blood, and your organs essentially ceased to function, and you died very quickly. It was, if you got infected, it was passed on by mosquitoes. Oh. If you got infected by a mosquito carrying the yellow fever virus, you developed a very high fever, then your body organs started to break down, you vomited this black, bloody bile and stomach contents, and in less than 2 days you were dead. And as I said, it decimated human populations. There are whole, in the garrison and St. Matthias Church, there are monuments to the number of soldiers, and particularly as people came from Europe, and it particularly affected soldiers of the British garrison there. They didn't have any prior antibodies, came out of Barbados, and in a few days they were dead from yellow fever. Yeah, dreadful disease.
On that sad yet informative note, we conclude this week's edition of Tales from the Tombs. Today's tales came from the tombs to be found in the yard of the Cathedral of St. Michael and All Angels. Do join us next week at the same time when historian Dr. Carl Watson and Senator Professor Henry Fraser resume their revelation of tales from the tombs to be found here in this yard. Thank you for staying with me. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.